Good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us for tonight. My name is David Milstein, and I'm a member of the Student Senate's new Public Affairs Committee. The Public Affairs Committee, which was founded this year as a replacement for and expansion of the Public Affairs Symposium, is dedicated to sponsoring lectures, seminars, and discussions that draw connections between academic issues and evolving national and international events. This semester, we are pleased to bring close to a dozen speakers to campus, all around a theme of the next great debates, perspectives on emerging issues. As part of this exciting new series, I am honored to introduce Ryan Anderson. But before I do, permit me to provide some context for tonight's lecture. In the fall of 2012, the Public Affairs Committee asked students to vote on specific topics they would want to discuss at Dickinson. One topic of strong interest is that of marriage. As a result, the Public Affairs Committee worked to bring speakers to campus to address this important and sensitive topic, and we sought to present speakers from both sides of this important debate. Marriage is the bedrock of our society. Undoubtedly, therefore, the definition of marriage and the role of government in this issue deserves a national conversation on its merits, where civil discourse and mutual respect for opinions are the standards to which we adhere. As you all can see, tonight's discussion cannot be timelier. The Supreme Court just heard two marriage cases last week, Hollingsworth v. Perry and United States v. Windsor. Hollingsworth v. Perry is the case challenging Proposition 8, a 2008 ballot initiative in California, where California voters went to the polls and voted in favor of the definition of marriage as being between a man and a woman. Ms. Perry, the petitioner, alleges Proposition 8 violates your due process and equal protection rights under the Constitution. The second case before the Supreme Court, United States v. Windsor, challenges Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, that defines marriage under federal law, that is, marriage as it applies to federal statutes only, as between one man and woman. When President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act into law in 1996, he stated DOMA, quote, confirms the right of each state to determine its own policy with respect to same-gender marriage. Mr. Anderson is here to discuss his latest work on the moral and constitutional questions surrounding the definition of marriage. Ryan Anderson is the William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and Free Society at the Heritage Foundation, one of the most influential conservative think tanks in America. Ryan Anderson graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from Princeton University, where he received a Bachelor of Arts. He's currently a doctoral candidate in political philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, where he graduated with a master's degree. At Heritage, Mr. Anderson also concentrates on issues regarding healthcare, education, moral principles of economics, justice, and natural law theory. He recently co-authored a book with well-known Princeton professor Robert P. George and Rhodes scholar Sheriff Burgess titled, What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. Together with Professor George and Mr. Burgess, Ryan Anderson also published a scholarly article in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy titled, What is Marriage? Ryan Anderson has since co-authored amicus briefs on the two marriage cases at the Circuit and Supreme Court levels and briefed members of Congress on the arguments before the Supreme Court. His tremendous and important work on marriage has led to the publication of his columns at the Wall Street Journal, CNN.com, the Washington Post, and National Review. He has made frequent appearances on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. The New York Times and NPR have both published articles featuring Ryan Anderson that I encourage you all to read. We very much appreciate Mr. Anderson's travel to our campus and are pleased to have such an important and influential young thinker at Dickinson tonight. Following tonight's lecture, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. Please join me now in giving a warm welcome to Ryan Anderson.
Great. Well, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be speaking here. And it's great to talk about this question in an academic setting. I spent most of last week talking about this question in a media setting, which often just devolves into name calling and sound bites and sloganeering. And the great thing about a university is that we can avoid that and look at the assumptions and presumptions on both sides of this debate, because both sides come to the table with assumptions and presumptions. So we can get beyond the empty sloganeering and get beyond I like to quote Jonathan Rauch when I give these talks. At the beginning, Jonathan Rauch is the author of what I think is one of the best books in favor of same-sex marriage. And he says that the debate over marriage isn't between bigots and perverts, that there are people of goodwill and sound mind on both sides of this question. And so he always encourages his listeners and his readers to get beyond that dichotomy, and I think it's a good way to start. So I'll say a brief word about what I'm not going to say tonight. I'm not going to say anything about morality, the morality of same-sex sex, or the morality of non-marital sex, or anything like that. So morality won't be on the table today. I'm not going to talk about religion. I think there are religious views in favor of redefining marriage, or religious views against it, but the argument I'm making tonight isn't based on religion. And I'm not going to talk about tradition, as if just because this is the way marriage has been, this is the way marriage ought to be. So it's not going to be a conservative argument from tradition, a la Burke. Burkeans will make arguments based on tradition. That's not what I'm going to say. Although it is worth pointing out, just as a factor, so here's a datum that needs to be explained. Every political community that we know of, every political community that has lasted long enough to leave a record of itself, up until the year 2000, recognized marriage, and it recognized marriage as a male-female institution. Likewise, every religious community that we know of recognized marriage as a male-female institution. That raises the question of why. So that's what I want to get at in today's lecture. Why is it that various and diverse political and religious communities who disagree on more or less everything else have agreed that marriage is a male-female institution? And I want to argue that there's something rational and intelligible that explains that historic consensus. And so it's not an appeal from authority, either of a religious tradition or a political tradition, but it's investigating why, answering that question. One other thing I'm not going to say, I'm not going to talk about homosexuality or sexual orientation. That's not also, I don't think that's at stake in this debate either. I think what's at stake in this debate is with marriages. So I'll be speaking about marriage tonight. I think the leading argument from the other side doesn't work. And I think it is empty smoke and mirroring. And that's the rhetoric of marriage equality. Everyone in this debate is for marriage equality. Everyone wants marriage laws to treat people equally. They want to recognize all marriages and treat all marriages equally. The question, though, before you get to the debate about equality, it's back to marriage. What is marriage? Unless you know what marriage is, you can't say whether or not a given marriage policy is treating its citizens equally or unequally. Whether or not a given marriage policy is treating all marriages equally, or if it's treating only some marriages equally. So that's why I think we have to answer the prior question. That's why we titled our law review article in our book, What is Marriage? On the best philosophical account in favor of redefining marriage to include same-sex couples, marriage is understood, in the words of John Covino, a philosophy professor at Wayne State University, as your number one person. A marital relationship is about your number one relationship with your number one person. And what sets marriage apart from other forms of human relationship, from other forms of sociability and companionship, is the emotional priority, the emotional intensity. Marriage has what your other relationships have, it has more of it, it has the most of it. It's your number one relationship. On this view, my co-authors and I say this just collapses and conflates marriage with companionship. That there's no difference on this understanding of what marriage is that sets it apart from other forms of sociability. And this is why we say that there's pitfalls for this account. We think, one, it can't explain marital norms, what sets marriage apart. Two, it doesn't understand how redefining marriage would cause harms to the political community. And then three, it can't even account for the internal contradictions of the rhetoric of marriage equality. So I'll briefly touch on those, and then I'm going to launch into my positive argument about what marriage is and why it matters. So again, on the emotional intensity, emotional union understanding of what marriage is, it seems that they can't account for the marital norms of monogamy, sexual exclusivity, and the pledge of permanence. If marriage just is your number one person, why not marriage be a permanent relationship? Emotions wax and wane, they come and go. Why should marriage even have an expectation of being permanent, rather than just lasting for as long as the love lasts, just lasting for as long as the emotion that unites the spouses lasts? It seems that they have a hard time explaining why the marital relationship, unlike other forms of human relationship, is expected to be a permanent relationship. Likewise, I don't think they can explain why marriage ought to be sexual, let alone sexually exclusive. Some couples will find that sex enhances their emotional union. Other couples might find that it doesn't. Some couples will find that being sexually exclusive will enhance their relationship. Others will find that having sexual relationships outside of the marital bond will enhance their emotional connection. So again, it seems that the proposers of the redefinition have trouble explaining why marriage is a sexual and a sexually exclusive relationship. Finally, I don't think they can explain the norm of monogamy. If marriage is just about an intense emotional union, why is it only between two people? Intense emotional unions can exist between more than two people. They can exist between groups, they can exist serially between multiple relationships. What is it about an emotional union just as such that demands that it be monogamous? And then lastly, why is government even in the marriage business on this account? If marriage is just about an intense emotional relationship, we can get the state out of the bedroom. And why are the proponents of redefining marriage asking to put the state in their bedrooms? Why is government in the business of recognizing my number one person, my number one friendship, my number one relationship? On this account, I don't think you can explain why government has and does recognize marriage in every political community that we know of. So those are the challenges. These are the challenges that I've gone to different law schools, I've spoken in different places, and I always put to the audience at the beginning. And I invite answers to these questions during the Q&A. The last thing I would point to is the internal contradictions. People who argue in favor of marriage equality say that justice demands that our laws recognize same-sex couples as marriages. Why same-sex couples and not same-sex thruples? Thruple is a term that I only recently learned when I was doing research for the book. New York Magazine introduced me to this term. A thruple is a three-person couple. Why would the same-sex couple have a right, as a matter of equality and justice, to the marriage license, but the same-sex throuple will not? And this is what Justice Sotomayor was getting at last week during oral arguments when she asked Ted Olson, the attorney arguing against Proposition 8, saying, all right, well, if you say there's a fundamental right to marry and your understanding of marriage is just whoever you happen to be in love with, what limits could the state place on this fundamental right to marry as you understand it? And she said, all right, well, maybe there will be something with age of consent, so the state has an interest in protecting minors. But she was saying, is there any reason why the state would prohibit incestual marriages or plural marriages? So she asked the question about the number. How many parties to the marriage? And this isn't to engage in slippery slope reasoning or ad hominem. Newsweek magazine reported in 2009 that there are 500,000 polyamorous households in America. If they go before the court and say, we want marriage equality, what principle, with the laws based on principle, we don't want our marriage laws being arbitrary, what principle would say that marriage isn't a polyamorous or polygamous relationship? And it seems that the marriage equality people are throwing the poly community under the bus as they argue for marriage equality for same-sex couples, but not for thruples and quartets and other arrangements. So with that, I'll start launching into the positive argument in the book that we make as to what marriage is. We argue that marriage is a comprehensive relationship, and that this is what sets it apart from other relationships. And that the way that we analyze relationships comes right out of Aristotle by looking at the actions, the goods, and the norms that govern the relationship. And so to show how this works, I'll illustrate it by using an academic community like Dickinson College. Academic communities, what sets them apart from other communities, you can look at what type of action is distinctive of the academic community. You go to lecture, you listen, you take notes, your professor delivers lectures, he or she holds office hours, you visit them during office hours, you ask questions, you write term papers, they grade term papers, they write articles and books, you read their articles and books. Those are the types of academic actions that take place. And that's what sets an academic community apart from an athletic team or a barbershop. It may be the case that you engage in those types of actions in the locker room or at the barbershop, but that's not what constitutes a barbershop. Barbershop action will involve shampooing and cutting and trimming, those types of actions. The sports team will involve athletic competition, things like that. What makes the academic community an academic community is academic action. What are the academic actions pursuing? What's the good that it's looking after? It's looking after the truth of the matter. It's looking after knowledge. All of those actions are oriented or ordered towards discovering the truth. Getting rid of opinion, getting rid of bias, getting rid of prejudice, and actually discovering what's really true. And that's why you orient yourself through those actions. And then what norms govern academic behavior? Things citing all of your sources, not plagiarizing. If you're a scientist, recording all of the data that supports your hypothesis, but also the data that contradicts it, so that some other scholar who then is investigating your study can then look at all the evidence, both pro and con, and do a counter study or make a counter argument. So all the norms that govern academic life are governing it towards the good that it's aiming at. So we say this analysis of action, goods, and norms can be used to help illustrate what the marital relationship is. What makes marriage different than an academic community, or an athletic community, or a barbershop? And we say it's a comprehensive relationship, and comprehensive in three senses. Comprehensive in how it unites the spouses, comprehensive with respect to the good that it unites them towards, and comprehensive in how extensive a commitment it demands of the spouses. So we argue that one, it unites them in all dimensions of their being, both hearts and minds, but also, and distinctively, bodies. And that's what makes it comprehensive, that it extends the relationship apart from just emotions, but also into the bodily, because that's part of who we are. Second, it unites us not just with respect to any particular good, the good of the knowledge of Shakespeare, the good of winning this baseball game, but a comprehensive range of goods, the creation of new human life, and then the raising of that new human life so that that life can participate in the whole range of human goods. And then lastly, it calls for comprehensive commitments, in this case, an exclusive and a permanent commitment. So let me unpack that just a little bit. When we say that marriage unites spouses comprehensively, that it unites them in their minds, their hearts, and also their bodies, you can ask, what makes for a bodily union in the first place? What is it about my body that makes it unified? What is it about my heart, my lungs, my veins, my arteries, my muscles, my skin that makes them a unified organism? The answer is that they're all coordinated towards a common purpose. They're all coordinated towards a common good, the biological life of my being. In the same way, I'm radically complete with respect to all action but one. With respect to locomotion, digestion, vision, as a single individual, a man and a woman are complete. They can do it on their own. Their body is radically complete. But it's radically incomplete with respect to one biological function, and that's reproduction. And so it's the mated pair, the man and the woman in a conjugal act, that actually form a single organism with respect to one common biological end, that of reproduction. The mated man and woman don't just rub up against each other, they don't just touch or interlock the way you would if you stuck your finger in someone's ear, but they actually form a coordinated bodily activity towards a shared coordinated bodily function, regardless of what their intentions are. So it doesn't matter whether they're desiring to have a child or not. There's something objective about the type of union that they're forming based upon the type of action that they're engaging in. So we argue that this provides the biological basis of how this marital union is distinct from other friendships, it's distinct from other types of human sociability, and it extends our union not just to hearts and minds, but also to the body, because the body is part of who we are. We're incarnate beings, we're bodily beings. And to unite comprehensively with someone means to unite at all levels of your being. So then it's not surprising that the good that this is oriented towards is the good of procreation, family life, the generativity of the relationship, and then raising the child to maturity. So it's not pointed at any particular good, either the pleasure of the couple or the emotional satisfaction of the couple, but it's pointing to a whole broad range of human good, full range of human good, all human goods, because it's a new human life that the act that unites the spouses produce. So we'll say that the act that unites the spouse is the same act that produces new life. The lovemaking act is the life-giving act. And this tells us something about what's distinctive of this type of community. And lastly, we say if it's a comprehensive union, uniting spouses at all levels of their being, ordered towards a comprehensive good, it also objectively calls for certain norms that govern the relationship, exclusivity and permanency. And the type of exclusivity that it calls for is sexual exclusivity. So none of you are cheating on your spouse right now by attending a lecture. It doesn't call for academic exclusivity, or knowledge exclusivity, or conversation exclusivity. The type of exclusivity that is unique to the marital relationship is sexual exclusivity, because it's sex that's distinctive of the marital relationship because it extends a union of hearts and minds into a comprehensive union. And the type of commitment that it calls to be comprehensive and ordered towards protecting this new life together, it's called calls for a permanent commitment, because you can't unite with your spouse comprehensively if you're holding something back. If you're only uniting for 5 years or 10 years, there's a temporal limitation to the comprehensive nature of that union if you're going in with an escape clause. This is one reason why you might have reservations about prenups, for example. The account that I just gave in rough outline, and it takes 30 or 40 pages in the book, but that basic sketch is something that we found echoed in ancient thinkers of ancient Rome and Greece, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, Eusebius Rufus, in the theological traditions from Abraham, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in both the canon law, the civil law, and the common law traditions that shaped the West, but also in Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. And so that suggests to us that it isn't the particular domain of, it's not unique to any one of those political or religious or philosophical traditions, but that each one of those traditions grasps onto something intelligible and rational and unique because of human nature. And that's why in these distinct political, religious, and philosophical communities, we're able to agree on this aspect about what marriage is, even while disagreeing on a host of other questions. So that said, you might ask, who cares? Maybe you have identified a unique type of human sociability. There is something unique that a man and a woman can unite in this comprehensive way, and it's ordered towards a certain type of good, and it calls for certain types of commitment, and all these other communities up until the year 2000 understood it along these lines. Why should we care? And I think to approach that, you want to put this in a historical perspective. And we want to go back about 40 years to when government redefined marriage for the first time. And the definition that I'm talking about is the introduction of no-fault divorce. So prior to no-fault divorce laws, spouses could get divorced when there was cause. The expectation was marriage was a permanent relationship. But in common law, there was the triple A's that were grounds for divorce: abuse, abandonment, and adultery. And you would go to court and sue for divorce, and you would cite false grounds for the divorce. So my spouse was abusing me, my spouse abandoned me, my spouse committed adultery. And those would be the reasons why marriage would be terminated. With the introduction of no-fault divorce, spouses can now get divorced for any reason or for no reason at all. And what we saw 40 years later is that divorce rates that were in the single digits are now approaching nearly 50%. And so the law taught something. The law taught that marriage need not even have an expectation of permanency. That marriage should last as long as the love lasts. That the vision of what marriage is that informed divorce laws, no-fault divorce law, is radically similar to the vision of what marriage is that supporters of redefinition now have. That it's just about an intense emotional union, and that marriage should last for as long as those emotions last. But there's no reason in principle why you should have an expectation of permanency. So what was the fallout of this? The scholars and the activists who pushed for no-fault divorce were some of the first people who started agitating against it, because they saw the social consequences for women and for children from no-fault divorce. And they were horrific, in lives lost, in broken homes, broken hearts. And so they saw that as heterosexuals acting on bad liberal ideology without childbearing, cohabitation, divorce, absentee fathers, that were leading to the breakdown of the family and the associated harms that this caused. An increase in child poverty, a decrease in social mobility, an increase in crime, an increase in prison population, an increase in government spending and welfare programs. And so it was during the 80s and the 90s that you had scholars and activists like Maggie Gallagher and David who didn't have gay marriage or homosexuality anywhere on their radar screens. It's hard for us to realize this, people of our age, but back in the 80s and the 90s, almost no one was talking about same-sex marriage as even a logical possibility. So the original marriage movement, this original generation of scholars who were pushing for policies to strengthen marriage, weren't doing this out of any sort of anti-gay animus. They were doing this because they understood that the committed, monogamous, permanent relationship between a man and a woman benefits the spouses and the children that their union produces. And that this is what they were trying to strengthen. And they had programs like the fatherhood initiatives, like Healthy Marriage Movement, the Marriage Savers programs, all trying to recover a sounder understanding of what marriage is and why it matters. And then it was in the year 2003 when the Goodridge decision these people had to ask themselves, would redefining marriage to include same-sex couples strengthen the institution of marriage or weaken the institution of marriage? And the conclusion that most of them came to, in a couple of sense that had a change of heart, David Blankenhorn being the most notable, the conclusion that they came to back in 2003 up until this past summer, when Blankenhorn flipped on this, was that you couldn't redefine marriage to say that fathers are optional, while also stressing that fathers are essential. And that what they had been doing during the past 20 years was trying to stress the importance of fathers to the marital process and to the parenting to children. And that they couldn't do that if it was now understood to be a bigoted comment to say that men and women are different, mothers and fathers are different, and that children need both. And that the marriage institution, the marital relationship, is the institution that's about connecting these people. So that's why they then launched the second marriage movement, which now is more about responding to the push to redefine marriage, to exclude the norm of sexual complementarity. And this has been when I think this is now kind of the context in which we now find ourselves discussing marriage in that conversation, rather than the original marriage movement. But I don't think they should be separated. I think the people today who are advocating in defense of marriage, understood as the union of a man and a woman, a husband and wife, a mother and father, are doing it for the same exact reasons as the original marriage movement, because marriage matters. So that leads to the next part of the talk, which is what is the social function that marriage performs. And so here, if the argument that I gave about the comprehensive union of marriage is more of an ontological argument about what marriage is, this argument about what does marriage do for a society, what work does the marital relationship perform in a political community, and then why might the government care? And what we argue is that marriage exists as a social institution to bring together a man and a woman as husband and wife, to then be mother and father to any children that their being produces. That marriage connects goods and people that otherwise have a natural tendency to fragment. It connects sex with love, it connects husbands with wives, it connects sex with babies, and it connects babies with moms and dads. And that this doesn't happen by chance. It takes strong cultural and social signals and norms and pressures to make this happen. And the law will either play a supporting role in sending those signals, or it will play a destructive role and say that those things don't actually happen. And you can ask yourself this question. Whenever a child is born, a mother will be close by, because that's a biological fact. So the question is, will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? The social function that marriage performs is increasing the odds, increasing the likelihood that a father will be committed to the mother that just gave birth, and then the two of them will be committed to that child. And that's the social, that's what marriage does for the political community. If it was just about the romantic lives of consenting adults, government wouldn't care. We wouldn't need the government regulating our love life. We wouldn't need the government in the bedroom if it was just about the butterflies that adults get when they fall in love. The reason you have the state involved in this is that there's an externality. 9 months later, there can be a new life, and someone needs to be responsible for that new life. And marriage is a relationship that minimizes the state's role in this by incentivizing the likelihood, encouraging the man and woman who created the child to commit to each other and take responsibility for the child. Part of this is based on the fact that there's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering. That men and women interact with children in distinct and unique ways, and that children do best when they have the love and the care and the attention of both the mother and the father. David Popenoe, a sociologist at Rutgers University, back before the same-sex marriage debate really heated up, so this is back during the original marriage movement, he wrote a book titled Life Without a Father, compelling new evidence from the social sciences. And he was just looking at what we've now had a generation of children who were raised without dads. What does this look like? And he concluded, quote, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender-differentiating parenting is important for human development and that the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable." He then went on, quote, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary, culturally and biologically, for the optimal development of a human being." So that was his investigation of how men and women, mothers and fathers, parent, how they interact with kids. There were then other social scientists that looked at what does this look like at the aggregate? And they showed that children did best, on average, for the most part. So social science always deals with averages. So this doesn't mean that a child was born to a heroic single mother. I think every single mother really is heroic. It's the deadbeat dad that should get blamed in these situations, not the mother who is taking responsibility for the child. But it's not as if you were born to a single mother or your parents got divorced, and therefore you're doomed and destined to failure. But it is to say that social scientists who ran all these tests show that children did best when reared by their married mother and father. On a host of indices, including educational achievement, their literacy and graduation rates, their emotional health, rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicide. Their own sexual development later in life, so the timing of puberty, their likelihood of having a out-of-wedlock birth, their rates of sexual abuse, and then also their adult behavior, attention deficit disorder, their employment rates, their income rates. For each one of those measures, children who were given the gift of the love and the care of their married mother and father outperformed children in every alternative that was studied. So Child Trends, which is a DC think tank that is a left-leaning think tank in DC, unlike Heritage, we mean right, they left. They put out a report back in 2003, just before the Goodrich decision. This was the last moment in which a left-leaning think tank could say something like this before it became politically incorrect. They said, research clearly demonstrates that family structure matters for children, and the family structure that helps the most is a family headed by two biological parents. Children in single-parent families, children born to unmarried mothers, children in step-families or cohabiting relationships face higher risks of poor outcomes. There is thus value for children in promoting strong, stable marriages between biological parents. Even President Obama understood this. So in 2008, back before he evolved on the marriage question, so back when he was also in favor of marriage between a man and a woman, President Obama said, quote, "We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community were weaker because of it." That was President Obama's 2008 address on fatherhood. And he has spoken movingly, repeatedly, even in the State of the Union just in January, about the importance of fathers and how he wishes his father would have been involved in his life. And how that understanding of the importance of fathers actually inspires him to be a good dad to his 2 daughters. But how does the law teach that fathers are essential when the laws redefine marriage to say that fathers are optional? That's the question that I don't think the other side can answer. That also raises the question of why governments in the marriage business in the first place. And the first thing to say here is that marriage laws don't criminalize anything as far as same-sex relationships go. In all 50 states, 2 people of the same sex can live and love and choose to. Nothing is banned. The media has used terrible rhetoric throughout the past 10 years when they'll say, Californian citizens went to the polls yesterday to ban gay marriage. Nothing was banned when Californians went to the polls and voted for Prop 8. All that happened in Prop 8 was marriage. The word was defined for government purposes. Same thing with the Defense of Marriage Act. Same thing in the 41 states that define marriage as a union of a man and woman. Nothing is made illegal, nothing is made criminal, nothing is banned. So in all 50 states, 2 people can live with each other and love each other. They can join a liberal church and have that church perform a wedding for them. They can work for a progressive business and have that business give them marriage benefits, if the church chooses to, and if the business chooses to. What's at stake right now is whether or not the Supreme Court will redefine marriage and then force citizens and religious communities and businesses in all 50 states to recognize the relationship of a same-sex couple as a marriage, even if those individuals, those businesses, those religious communities don't think the same-sex relationship is a marriage. So the coercion here works in the exact opposite way than what is usually discussed in the media. The coercion here would be the court redefining an institution of civil society and then forcing all citizens and their associations to accept this new definition. But you can ask yourself, why would the state have an interest in the romantic lives of adults, where the possibility of procreation isn't even on the table? James P. Wilson, the eminent social scientist at Harvard and then at Pepperdine. He had written a book on marriage just before he passed away. His explanation of what marriage is, quote, "Marriage is a socially arranged solution for the problem of getting people to stay together and care for children that the mere desire for children and the sex that makes children possible does not solve." Marriage is a political community's least restrictive, least coercive, least intrusive way of ensuring that a new child that comes into life is reared to maturity as a law-abiding, productive member of society. Because the options here are either that the government will be responsible for raising that child, or the man and the woman who created the child will be raising that child. And that when the family breaks down, this is when we saw the welfare state explode. So it's during the 70s and the 80s that we saw the rising welfare state. So at the same time we saw child poverty break down. So a child is 82 times more likely to experience poverty if born outside of marriage. So we can either have the government pick up the pieces, because marriages either fail to form in the first place or they fall apart, or we can have government non-coercively incentivize an ideal, a relationship like between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, to do the work that civil society needs to do in raising the next generation. The Brookings Institution, so another left-leaning think tank in DC, this is probably the most prominent liberal think tank, found that between 1970 and 1996, so this is the original marriage movement, $229 billion in welfare expenditures to be directly traced to the breakdown of the marriage culture. A more recent study in 2008 showed that divorce and unwed childbearing alone cost taxpayers $112 billion each year. And then a study 2 years ago from Utah State University scholar David Schramm showed that just divorce costs local, state, and federal government $33 billion a year. So they're calculating what are the welfare programs that then have to pick up the pieces as marriages break down, and what's this costing taxpayers? Brad Wilcox, a sociologist at UVA, said that it goes beyond just the costs to the government, but it actually affects the entire economy. He wrote a report on the implications that family structures have for economic health. And his quote was, "The core message of this report is that the wealth of nations depends in no small part on the health of the family." He went on to say that marriage and fertility trends play an underappreciated and important role in fostering long-term economic growth, the viability of the welfare state, the size and quality of the workforce, and the health of large sectors in the modern economy. So for someone who's interested in limited government, I'm interested in limited government, I work for a conservative think tank, the options here are not getting the state out of marriage business, which some libertarians suggest. Getting the state out of the marriage business would be a surefire way of increasing all the intrusive government programs that would then be picking up the pieces of a culture that breaks down when marriages don't form. We've already seen that happen during the past 30 years, and nothing would put an end to that. Nothing would ameliorate that situation by getting the government out of marriage. Kay Heinowitz is a scholar at the Manhattan Institution. She wrote a book back in 2008 titled Marriage and Caste in America. And the central argument of her book was that insofar as America has a caste system, it's based on marriage. It's the same argument that Charles Murray made earlier this year in his book, Coming Apart. And what they found is that upper middle class, college-educated, white America gets married at rates that look more or less like the 1950s and 1960s. The sexual revolution hasn't really affected their families, but that the lower classes of America, particularly racial and ethnic minorities in America, where this isn't happening, that's what perpetuates cycles of poverty. And what he argued, and what Heinowitz argued, is that the elites need to start preaching what they practice. That they're sending cultural signals that are then deteriorating the very foundations of prosperity for future generations. So if you care about social justice, if you care about social mobility, one of the most important things you could do is to try to maximize the chance that a newborn child will have the love and the care of their mother and their father until they reach age 18. And that nothing the government has tried to do to ameliorate that has actually paid off any dividends. So then I'll move into the second and last portion of the talk, and we'll get to the Q&A. What are the harms of redefining marriage? The starting point for understanding this is to say that law doesn't work in a vacuum. That law shapes culture, culture shapes beliefs, and then beliefs shape action. And the example that I gave towards the beginning of the lecture is that when the law redefined marriage with no fault changed popular understanding of what marriage is, so that it was a temporary rather than a permanent relationship. And over the course of a generation, we saw the fruits of that. Nearly half of all marriages end in divorce. So that's one way in which the law would teach. If the law was to now teach that marriage is a relationship of your number one best person, in Corvino's language, it would teach that marriage is more about the desires of adults than about the needs of children. It's more about the romantic and emotional life of consenting adults, whatever size and shape they might come in, than about the rights of children to the love and the attention of the man who created the child. It wouldn't even hold up as an ideal. There would be no institution in public life that upheld an ideal that a child deserved a mother and a father, that men and women bring different gifts to the parenting enterprise, and that children do best when raised by a mother and a father. That would be eliminated from our public policy and from our law. And in fact, to suggest otherwise would make it the equivalent of a bigot. So we've already seen in several jurisdictions that created same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, in Illinois, and in Washington, D.C., Christian adoption agencies that replacing orphans with mothers and fathers were forced to shut down because they were discriminating against same-sex couples. And this had nothing to do with government funding, which is something that you'll hear from the left right now. It's like, oh, if you're taking government money, you can't discriminate. Nothing to do with funding. In each and every one of these cases, it just did with licensing. You can't run an adoption agency without a government license. And the government was only licensing those adoption agencies that would place children on an equal footing with traditional married couples of mothers and fathers and same-sex couples. And the adoption agency said, look, according to our religious conviction, but also according to the best social science that we have, children do best with a mom and a dad, and we want to keep placing kids in those families. Let the other adoption agencies place children with same-sex couples if they want to. And the law said no, shut them down. So again, it's not a live and let live libertarian type solution that you'll hear in the media. The law will teach, and what it will teach is that those who continue to believe that gender matters and that marriage is a gendered institution between a man and a woman will be treated in the same way that we treat racist bigots. So if you think to the court case, was it with Bob Jones University? So Bob Jones, that court case, they were preventing interracial dating on campus. They lost their tax exempt status. The government used everything short of actually shutting down the university, which they can, but they used everything short of that to stigmatize Bob Jones. In this case, I think that was appropriate because skin color is irrelevant to what marriage is. So one of the arguments that we heard from the left is that, oh, you were in favor of marriage and man and woman. You're no different than the racist bigots who were against interracial marriage. Two things to point out about that argument is that first, there's no history of marriage being restricted to people of the same race. That was a relatively new phenomenon that was largely a part of white supremacy. Marriage was not restricted to people of the same races in ancient Greece, or ancient Rome, or Judaism, or early Christianity, or Islam. Never, you won't find it in Immanuel Kant or in Gandhi. This was a relatively new phenomenon. And there was no basis based upon what marriage is that would limit it to people of the same skin color. A man and a woman can unite in marriage regardless of the color of their skin. Children need mothers and fathers regardless of the color of their skin. So while our marriage laws have to be colorblind, they can't be genderblind. Because what marriage is all about is uniting the two halves of humanity, uniting men and women, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers. But if the law now teaches that to say that is the equivalent of being a racist bigot, then it will treat those individuals, and those religious communities, and those business communities that hold on to that understanding of marriage in the same exact way that it treats racists. The last harm that I think redefining marriage will lead to is a complete undermining and undefining of the marital relationship in the first place. So I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that if you eliminate the norm of sexual complementarity, that marriage is a male-female institution, you're left with no principal reason for why marriage should be a monogamous relationship, why marriage should be a sexually exclusive relationship, and why marriage should be a permanent relationship. And it's not surprising that when we were doing research for the book, that many of the most prominent advocates and scholars, including law professors at places like NYU and Yale, former professor of mine at Princeton, Cornell, and Hollywood figures, people like that, so across the spectrum of scholars and activists, were saying that we should get rid of those other three norms, that they were arbitrary, And then largely they were just hangovers of a repressive Western culture, partly the inheritance of Judeo-Christian ethics. So you see scholars and activists say you should have plural marriages. 300 academics signed a statement beyond marriage, calling for legal recognition of multi-person, multi-sexual person, sexual union relationships, polyamory, and polygamy. So they were saying they agreed with the logic of Justice Sotomayor's question of what was limited to monogamous relationship. Why not marriage equality, not just for same-sex couples, but same-sex couples in quartets? They agree with that argument. They also say, and this was a profile of Dan Savage in the New York Times last year, he was saying that one thing that the straight community could learn from the gay community is the virtues of extramarital sex. And his two criteria is that there be no coercion and no deception, but that otherwise there shouldn't even be an expectation of sexual fidelity. That if you want to have it, fine. If you want to have open relationships, that's also fine. And you should do whatever brings the greatest emotional satisfaction for any given set of consenting adults. And Elizabeth Brake, the law professor, has argued that we should actually have marriage laws from the get-go that come with expiration dates. That you should sign a 5 to 10 year marriage certificate, and then you can renew it if things are going well. And that this would minimize the trauma of divorce. So rather than the expectation being of marriage lasts forever and then you get a divorce, I mean, marriage lasts for 5 or 10 years and then you can renew it if it's going well. It's like having a lease to your car or to your house. You know, you're not necessarily expected to live in your apartment for the rest of your life, but you can keep renewing it if you're like it. That's how we should re-envision what marriage is. So again, it's not just that there's a logical case, but it's that the same exact activists who are currently agitating for the court to redefine marriage in this respect are also agitating for these other aspects of marriage to change. And now, whatever the morality of sexually plural relationships and sexually open relationships and temporary relationships, I'm not going to address the morality of these things, but the public policy implications would be a nightmare. Because the public policy implications, particularly for heterosexuals who engage in sexual relations with multiple people outside of marriage on a temporary basis, is that you increase the likelihood of creating fragmented families. You increase the likelihood of creating fatherless children. For every sexual partner that I have, whether it be in a plural relationship, polyamory, or polygamy, for every sexual partner that I have outside of marriage, for every sexual partner to whom I'm only committed to a 5 or 10 year basis, I increase the likelihood that I'll be creating a child to whom my intention and devotion will be divided. Divided between the various women that I have had children with, and divided between the various families and households in which I had those children. So from the government's perspective, from the public policy perspective, from the perspective of the political community, this would be a nightmare. And yet the logic of marriage equality would say that it would be a demand of justice. That this is what is required of us if we're to have marriage law that treats people justly. So I'll conclude with the question of whether or not this is a winnable battle. And this might only irritate people in the audience more than what I've already said. One of the messages that was repeatedly put to me during the past week was, if you're a young person, everyone in your generation more or less seems okay with gay marriage. Aren't you on the wrong side of history? And this was more or less asked in each one of these things that I did. And the answer is twofold. First is that history doesn't judge anyone, because history isn't a person, and history can't judge anyone. I'm not going to be judged by history. And also that history is not a blind force that we're carried along by. It's not as if history is some Hegelian force in which we're passive observers. No, history is shaped by the participants in history, the people who make up history, people like you and me in this room. And so history will be shaped either because people like me and you make arguments that support the truth about what marriage is, or because people like me and you make arguments that support something that's not true about marriage. And we've seen this happen before. I like to make a historical analogy with the abortion issue. 40 years ago, the court settled the abortion issue with the Roe v. Wade decision. Or at least that's how it was popularly understood at the time. The New York Times announced that the court had settled the abortion issue. And little by little, public opinion shifted rapidly in favor of abortion rights. And all the media elites said that that all the young people were in favor of abortion. And that the only people opposed to abortion were the elderly and the Pope in Rome. Little by little, public previously were pro-life evolved to become pro-choice. So we forget that Ted Kennedy, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Jesse Jackson were all pro-life at the beginning of their political careers. And they too evolved because they thought that was the sign in which history was moving. Now, 4 years later, we see that our generation is more pro-life than our parents' generation, and that a majority of Americans now identify themselves as pro-life, whereas before it was a majority of Americans who identified as pro-choice. What took place? Academic arguments were developed, political coalitions were formed, grassroots activist communities were organized. Someone had to come up with the height of it, policy, and Hyde came up with that, political goal. Someone had to come up with the judicial nomination criteria for Ronald Reagan. It was Ed Meese. Someone had to come up with the arguments that combated Peter Singer on infanticide and abortion. It was John Finnis and Robbie George. All this work took place. The sonogram was developed. The March for Life was quickly organized. And now this past year was the largest March for Life, the majority of whom were people under the age of 25. And so history doesn't move by blind forces in which we're just pawns. History moves based upon the choices that we make. And I think this marriage question is a very open question right now. I don't think the public opinion polls right now are even accurately tracking public opinion on the issue, because each and every time that citizens have actually gone to the ballot box, the one poll that actually matters, they voted in favor of marriage by sometimes 5 to 15 points higher than what the public opinion poll showed the previous day. So if you remember back to just this past year in North Carolina, citizens went to their polls, all of the news stations were saying that it was too close to call. They were saying North Carolina was going to be the first state to vote in same-sex marriage. The final poll that mattered at the ballot box, 62% of the citizens in North Carolina voted for traditional marriage, and 38% voted to redefine marriage. Yet the media told us the day before that election that it was a 50-50 election. They were off by 20-some points. So I think there's somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy that the media wants to be putting forward right now, that public opinion is rapidly shifting. I don't deny that it's shifting, I just deny that it's shifting nearly as rapidly as they claim. I think most Americans understand that marriage is distinct and unique for a reason, that men and women are different. Marriage unites a man and a woman in a specific life because kids and moms and dads. So with that, I'll stop. I think we have, I don't know where the clock is, but I think we have time for some questions, and I'd be happy to answer anything you want to ask me. Thank you. So great questions. Let me give you a couple of responses to these. First, I think you can settle a question about benefits without redefining marriage. So for example, in California, they have agreements for same-sex spouses, and then the California court said, well, that's not enough. Separate equals is unequal. So you can try to arrange protections, legal protections for people in domestic partnerships that need not redefine marriage. And so to give an example of the Defense of Marriage Act, the case that was being argued on Wednesday last week before the Supreme Court, it involves a lesbian couple that were married in Canada, they lived in the state of New York, were married in Canada because New York they didn't have same-sex marriage at that time. And when one of the spouses passed away, the other one was hit with the federal marriage tax. And she sued the federal government saying, had we been recognized as a married couple, we wouldn't have been hit with this tax. And she sued to get marriage redefined. I think the better solution is to eliminate the inheritance tax. So for the past 15 years, the Heritage Foundation has been advocating for the repeal of the inheritance tax because it's bad public policy. It's a bad tax policy. Everyone, not just the married people, but everyone, even a single person who's not married, needs to have someone who can visit them in the hospital, needs to have someone who can inherit their belongings when they pass away. And you don't have to redefine marriage to craft public policy that would serve all Americans. So I just think on the questions of benefits and things like that, those are secondary issues. Marriage is not primarily about a grab bag of benefits, and we can craft public policy that would address the specific benefit issues that you raised. And in fact, we have handled the hospital visitation issue. That was handled 3 years ago at the Department of Health and Human Services. So a lot of the talking points that are continuing to be replaying in the media are even now historically updated because we have crafted the policy to address it. On your question of children, yes, having two parents that are in a same-sex relationship is better than having no parents. But in the words of President Obama, you're presenting us with a false choice, a false dilemma. Those aren't the options. The option isn't no parents or gay parents. The option can be, and right now we have more than enough traditionally married mothers and fathers on waiting lists to adopt children. That's the case for more or less all children. As older children, the numbers shift because most people are more inclined to want to adopt a baby. So we had a discussion of what happens with children over the age of 4 or something, when there actually is a shortage of adoptive parents. But for the vast majority of children, there's a waiting list of adoptive parents. And it's not a choice between no parents or same-sex parents. There's a question of what does society owe the orphan child? And I think what society owes the orphan child is a mother and a father. And that we should craft our adoption policies to maximize the likelihood that a child that already has suffered once in life, there already been, somehow they came into the situation in which they need to be adopted. But what we should now give to that child is the best chance that they can have to flourish in life. And we know that mothers and fathers being different, and men and women bringing different gifts to the parenting enterprise, that child will be best, on average, for the most part, for the mom and dad. And so I think we should incentivize that as our adoption policy. Yeah, in that.
Okay, I think that a lot of what you're saying a child needs in terms of needing a mother and a father because they bring different things to the table is actually just a misunderstanding of what gender is. It's very much not, like one gender doesn't bring something better to the table than another gender. What matters for children is growing up in a loving home and amongst a loving community. So that has nothing to do with gender, that has to do with the people that are raising you, no matter what gender they are. So I'm gonna have to disagree with you on that point.
Okay, I mean, the wonderful thing about university is that we're free to disagree. If you had some evidence to support your opinion on that, that would be helpful.
Well, I don't have
But the social science of this show that mothers and fathers interact with their kids in different ways. And I didn't say that one was better, as if mothers are better than fathers or fathers are better than mothers. It's that they're different. And they bring distinct gifts to the parenting enterprise. And that children do best when they have access both to the female half of humanity and the male half of humanity, because mothers and fathers raise their kids in different complementary ways. And you can go further and say that every child is the result of a union between a man and a woman. Every child has as a biological fact, a mother and a father. And what we want public policy to do is to increase the odds that the child will have the mother and the father that created them, raising them. That's what the child deserves as a matter of justice. And it's not because one is better than the other. It's just that they're different, and that children do best according to the social science with one of each. And so we can disagree, so I'm sure we do disagree with it, but that's where the evidence is so far. Yep.
Here's some evidence also. The American Association of Pediatrics recently came out with a study that determined that it didn't matter what gender parents were, as long as they were two parents in a committed home, committed relationship. Yeah. And also there's other studies that show that children of lesbian parents
do even better.
Yeah, do even better on average. So I think that that's enough evidence.
No. So we disagree. So it wasn't the American Association of Pediatrics, it was the American Academy of Pediatrics. And what we should know at the American Academy of Pediatrics is that this is a left-wing advocacy group. So there are two different pediatrician professional groups. One's the American Academy, one's the American College. And the American Academy of Pediatrics also also has come out with studies in support of a balanced approach to deficit reduction and a position on which handguns should be banned. This isn't a group of objective-minded doctors or something like the science. It's a left-wing advocacy group. And so, yeah, it's true that they issued a press release the week before the Supreme Court cases, but it wasn't a study. So we talked about that there was no new evidence they presented. What they did was they issued a press release saying that, in our opinion, we think same-sex parents are just as good as opposite-sex parents. If you then look at the studies that they relied on, so you look through their footnotes, they actually cited a bunch of previous studies that have been discredited on this, because the sample sizes weren't large or random or representative. So the studies that we allude to about lesbians actually doing a better job than mothers and fathers all used a technique known as snowball sampling, convenience sampling. And the average respondent looked something like this: a dual-income, upper-middle-class, white lesbian family living in Manhattan or San Francisco. From a sample size that looks like that, you can draw absolutely no conclusion as to what a representative lesbian relationship looks like as far as raising kids go. Because it hasn't controlled for a host of variables that the other social science, the original generation of social science and family structure, controlled for. You control for things like race, for education, for income, for social status, for geography. They almost had no same-sex parents in Middle America. Likewise, they had, I think there are exactly 2 studies that looked at gay parenting. So all of the studies saying that same-sex parenting is great for kids were all of lesbian parents. So we have no idea what it looks like when a child is raised without a mother. Because the studies that we have of single parenting was almost always single mothers. And the studies that we do have of same-sex parenting was of lesbian parenting. So it's outrageous that a group like the American Academy of Pediatricians would claim to be speaking on behalf of science in this question. The amicus brief that you should read on this issue is written by Harvey Mansfield and Leon Cass. Professor Mansfield teaches at Harvard in their government department. Professor Cass teaches at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. And the amicus brief that they filed with the Supreme Court said, there may come a day at which we can say that science shows that gender doesn't matter for parenting. But that day is not yet now. And their conclusion was that anyone that says that science supports the redefinition of marriage is not acting on the basis of science, but ideology. And that was their exact quote, that it was ideology, not science. And so I would encourage you, if you do a Google search for Leon Cass, Harvey Mansfield, amicus brief, gay marriage, it'll be one of the first things that pop up. And they just go through some of the studies that the advocates and activists relied on, and just showed one by one, here are the flaws in the studies. The sample size wasn't large, the sample size wasn't random, the sample size wasn't representative. And from samples that you more or less just multiply and duplicate a whole bunch of bias upon bias upon bias, it's not surprising you get a biased conclusion. Yeah?
You talk a lot about the actions lines of good marriage, and also about how important reproduction is to marriage. How would you feel about a marriage between 2 people, either one of them or both of them are infertile? And also, do you consider women as property part of the norms of marriage? You say that marriage has been the same pretty much up until 2000, but for a very long time, until pretty much the 19th century, women were considered property. And also, you seem to have a great deal of care for children. Would you also support educational and healthcare programs and after-school programs for children?
Okay, great questions. So no, I think government-run education has been a nightmare for children. And so I support school choice. I'm pro-choice of education, and I don't think we should have a government run a monopoly on public education. I think public education should actually be education of the public by the public. And so I think we should have voucher programs. I think we should have lots of school choice programs, because I don't think government-run education or government-run healthcare actually does a great job for the poor. If anything, I think our public schools have trapped the generation of students in poverty. So on that note, on the other question, no, I don't think women are property, and I don't think and I don't think that most of the either political, religious, or philosophical traditions view them as property either. And what I said, I didn't say that there was a traditional view of marriage that all of these traditions share. I said that one thing that they shared, that they agreed on, even while disagreeing on many other aspects. And so some of them did view women as property, but I don't think the majority view women as property. But the remarkable thing is that one thing that they agreed on, even while disagreeing on so many other things, was that marriage was a male-female relationship. On the question of infertility, this is one that Justice Kagan put to Chuck Cooper during oral arguments for Proposition 8. And I think she, by getting the courtroom to laugh, actually misunderstood the response that he was trying to do. And I think there's a rather reasonable answer. First, infertility has never been an impediment to marriage in either civil law, common law, or canon law. Infertility was never a basis, for example, to have an annulment, whereas impotency was. So if your spouse was impotent and couldn't consummate the marriage in both civil law, common law, and canon law, that would be grounds for declaring that marriage never took place, because the relationship was never extended beyond hearts and minds into a bodily, comprehensive union. But infertility was never understood that way, because it's not a matter of whether or not 9 months later a child comes out that makes the spouses unite. It's a question of whether or not they can engage in a conjugal action that unites them as a single reproductive principle, regardless of whether or not reproduction takes place. From the state's interest, though, and this is what Chuck Cooper was trying to explain to Justice Kagan, the state still has an interest in marital norms, precisely because men almost always remain fertile until their death. So this is what Chuck Cooper was trying to explain. Scalia had given a smart alecky response of saying, well, it seems like that could violate our privacy rules if we actually ask people about their fertility status before giving them a marriage agreement. And then Justice Kagan said, oh, look, we just have an age requirement of 55. She got the court in the lab. I know that there's no married couple over the age of 55 that's going to reproduce. And then Cooper's explanation was that actually, no, the state still has an interest in having that man remain faithful to his wife, because that decreases the odds of him creating a fragmented family. So for the 55-year-old man who remains faithful to his infertile wife, he's not creating a child with his secretary. And that's in the state's interest here, in preventing fragmented family formation. But still, I would say that the individual marriage does nothing to detract from teaching the truth about what marriage is. It doesn't send a message that men and women are the same, or that 2 men or 2 women are the same as the mother and father, that fathers are optional. So it has none of the costs, and it has several of the benefits of marriage. Yeah?
Can you comment, based on some of the questions that have come on the Mark Regner study that I've read, and how that, whether or not you use that in your book, and how that compares to some of the other studies?
Yeah, so we mentioned that in passing the book. The Regner study, Mark is a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and he published a study this past August that came out. It was one of the first studies, actually it was the first study, I shouldn't say one. It was the first study that used a random, and a representative sample of children. And they weren't self-reporting, parents reporting on the children, there was now grown children reporting on their own family type. So it was children between the ages of 18 and 39 reporting back on what their family life had been like, and what their lives are now like. Are you employed? How much money do you make? Are you on antidepressants? Have you tried to commit suicide? Were you sexually abused? Have you been married in the course of a whole set of questions like that? And they got a large enough sample, a random and a representative sample, that included enough respondents who had been raised by men or women who were in same-sex relationships. These weren't same-sex marriages, obviously, because same-sex marriage didn't exist. But they got to the nearest approximation that they could, which was same-sex romantic relationship. And what they found was that children who had grown up with a parent who had engaged in the same-sex relationship did worse on a host of those measurable scales, like employment and substance abuse and graduation rates and sexual abuse and things like that. That's not a central part of our argument in the book. So the argument is that social science in this is still very, very new. But we do think this is the first study that we do have that has met the gold standard of social science, and so that should give us a pause. But the main argument, the causality of how we think redefining marriage works, isn't that a small handful of gay and lesbian households are going to raise children that turn out poorly. We think the causality is going to work different. The causality is going to teach something about marriage that will further weaken the marriage culture. So the causality that marriage will now teach that what marriage is more about adult desire than needs of children. And what marriage is more about adult emotional satisfaction than the rights of children. What marriage is more about an emotional union where men and women are interchangeable, so that mothers and fathers likewise are interchangeable. And then we think further that if the activists who are pushing for same-sex marriage, if we can take them at their word, and I see no reason why we should doubt them, that they're also in favor of weakening the other marital arms. So the redefinition of marriage wouldn't just stop here today. It would continue in the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So that the next generation would be having the discussion about polyamory and polygamy and sexually open relationships and temporary marriage license. So we see this as just a stepping stone towards the complete unraveling of what marriage is and why it matters, and not just of an expanding of who is eligible for marriage. So we open the book by saying what's at stake here is not, should we just expand the pool of people eligible for marriage? No, it's, should we replace the historic understanding of marriage as a gendered institution, which can then explain why it's a monogamous, non-exclusive, and permanent institution? Should we replace that understanding with a different understanding of what marriage is? And that's where we think the consequences will come out. Not so much from what Ragnaris showed, which is that it does seem that children who were raised by parents in same-sex romantic relationships did have worse outcomes. Yeah. Oh no, wait, I already went through, so I want to get someone else. There was someone else on this side. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Sophie, by the way. I have had the fortune of having one of my very best friends, Spencer Perry, who is Chris Perry's son. I've known him for years and years in my family, and he and his brother are two of the most, compassionate, smart, driven, successful, teenagers I've ever met. Spencer was youth governor of California for youth government that last year. I think he's going to have a tremendous career in public service. And I think that is so, there's a very direct correlation between his success and the kind of parenting that he's had the fortune of having his whole life, which was with two moms. And he himself will cite that over and over. And it makes no sense to me how, you could ever encounter someone like that and then turn around and think that, or say that these children will somehow have some harm inflicted upon them. And I'm also just, that was, I guess, a comment, but also just, you seem to compare the consequences of, same-sex marriage to divorce. And that, I don't understand that logic at all, because I obviously think that divorce is a bad thing, and that, obviously that's going to harm children, but it doesn't make any sense to me how that argument would be in any way applicable to ostensibly a relationship that is monogamous, committed, and probably for the purpose of having a child as well. I know that Chris had that intention going into the marriage.
Okay,
I'd
great.
really like to know your...
Yeah. So that's a good question, and I think it highlights how policy is made and what social science does. So social science tries to get us out of anecdotal evidence, because everyone knows it. I can give you examples of lots of children who had divorced parents and turned out really well. And I don't think what you just said, you think divorce is bad and that it harms kids, somehow demeans my friends who came from divorce homes and turned out really well. And yet I agree with you that we don't want to hold up divorce as like the ideal family situation, even though I have anecdotal evidence of children who came out of a divorced household just fine. I think the same thing is true with respect to same-sex parenting. We've all seen some of the YouTube videos of children testifying, but what the media hasn't covered are other people, their stories of growing up with two moms. So I published an article by Bobby Lopez. Bobby Lopez is a professor of English at one of the California universities here, which means Stanford. I could be wrong about that. If you Google Bobby Lopez growing up with two moms, the untold child story, he recounts how when he read the Mark Ragnaris study, that was the first academic study that told his life story. And he said, I've been trying to publish this for over 5 years and no one would publish it. So we're not hearing the voices of children who grew up in same-sex families, who did experience some of the heartbreak, some of the longing. He longed for a father figure. He didn't have a father growing up, and he wishes he would have had a father. We've also, I published an article by a guy named Doug Maingren, he has a child, and he was in a same-sex relationship, and he realized that he and his partner, even though they're the most committed fathers in the world, that neither of them could ever provide their children a mother. And that was what was driving him to recognize that there is something, even as a gay man, I can recognize that I can't provide my children with what they need of a mother and a father, the best gay parent, the best two gay parents in the world can't do that in the same way the best two lesbians can't do that. So I think that this is, there will be personal testimonies and personal stories on both sides of this discussion. The media tends to only highlight one side of it. And then I think what social science does is it tries to raise a level above the anecdotal evidence to something that has a control group and something that will be randomized and representative. And will have a large enough sample size that we get the stories like your friend and the story like Bobby Lopez. And we get enough of those stories in a data collection way so we can actually see what is the representative truth of America as a whole. So anyways, so that's how I would respond to that. And I think right now, the studies that we do have, we have one based on census data and we have the Rainier study, suggests that your friend's in a minority of this situation. But I would also say that I don't think we need to wait until the social science is in to postpone redefining a central institution, where we do know from all of the social science that has been conducted. And the reason that I mentioned divorce, cohabitation, even adoption, single parenthood, is that those are the family structures that have been studied repeatedly, multiple times. We have hundreds and hundreds of studies comparing the married biological mother and father relationship to divorce, divorce and marriage, single parenting, cohabitation, and adoption. And even in married adoption, children don't turn out as well as when there's a biological connection. And so one of the things that tells us is that the biological connection between a mother and a father and a child matters. Even when you try to replicate that in the case of adoption, not having that biological connection actually makes a difference. And so the best you could ever hope for in a same-sex parenting relationship is one parent that has a biological connection to the child. So one parent will always be an adoptive parent in a same-sex parenting scheme. And we do know that adoption places extra stress on children and on family formation. And we know that mothers and fathers interact with children in a different way. So there's reason to think, even though we don't yet have those studies, there's reason to be, what do you think the studies will show? There's a reason to have an expectation that based upon what we know about adoption, based upon what we know about gender parenting, that children raised in same-sex environments won't have the same advantages and the same gifts and privileges that children raised by their biological married mother and fathers. Yep.
I'm a firm believer in economic issues or social issues. That being said, you hinted at the fact that the studies that are biased show the very wealthy lesbian couples have more successful chances of raising their children. So in a situation like this where in the next year Obamacare is going to raise healthcare on most businesses by at least 30%, oftentimes much larger than that, this additional healthcare benefits that they would have to pay, wouldn't that cause the closure of many more businesses, higher unemployment, reducing the economy as a whole, making it harder to have these more affluent parents that could better raise children, hurting children overall?
Is that a question about marriage or about I tend to agree with you, but
I'm being a business major, but I just think that,
so anything that hurts the economy will have trickle-down effects on families and on children. So if you care about children and your own families, you would want to have economic policies that do the best, particularly for blue-collar jobs. I think right now the biggest challenge facing American families is the dearth of good middle-class and kind of blue-collar jobs for men. And there was this report released last week at the Brookings Institution titled "Not Yet, KNOT Yet." And what it shows that women are intentionally having children outside of marriage. So teen pregnancy has largely been reduced. We had a campaign against teen pregnancy and that was largely successful. And when we talk about single mothers in America today, it's largely people in their early 20s. And they're doing it intentionally because they want to get on with their lives and they want to be a mother, but they don't find marriageable men in their communities. And so what the investigators did was they said, there are economic causes of this. The collapse of factory work, the collapse of kind of blue-collar jobs. is making middle and lower class men. So the study was of middle America. They defined middle America as high school educated, if not college educated. So lower class America would be non-high school educated, upper class would be college educated. Middle America is in between. And they were investigating their marital and childbearing habits. And it was that first pregnancy was normally about a year and a half before marriage, on average. And they were saying this is a problem because those children have a lot less chance of having the father involved in their life. And they were saying there were both cultural and economic reasons for this. And the economic reasons they pointed to were things about blue-collar jobs. The cultural reasons for this were largely just the media signal that marriage and fathers are superfluous. That it's okay to have a child inside marriage, okay to have a child outside marriage, okay to have a child with a father, okay to have a child without a father. And that, a generation that had sent that cultural message that had been learned by this generation. We're running out of time, so I want to go back to the original question that I posed. That if we're going to, since the case is at the court, what is the answer to Justice Sotomayor? And I just want to know if there is a response from anyone here. If justice and equality demand that we redefine marriage to include same-sex couples, why would we not be violating the equality and the justice rights of Americans that are in same-sex couples or opposite-sex quartets? Yeah.
Well, I think it's because monogamy currently exists as a legal institution while polygamy doesn't. And before, like when you first started, you said that it seems as though people petitioning for gay marriage are throwing polygamous couples under the bus. But I would actually argue, and I actually agree with you that marriage is an exclusive institution, but I would argue that that's been happening since marriage has existed as a monogamous institution. I don't think it's fair to put that on the gay community. I think that's to be put on the entire monogamous community.
But why?
As it stands.
So the question is, if I was just to say, well, historically marriage has always been a male-female relationship, therefore we shouldn't redefine it to make it a male-male or female, you would respond, look, you can't just go to history.
Well,
so just like historically it's been a monogamous relationship, doesn't give a reason for why it should remain a monogamous relationship.
I think that it's just about making changes. Like, you can't change everything all at once. I think everyone agrees upon that. Right now, I think it really is an issue of separate but equal, where we're looking at these monogamous couples who are maybe have the same rights, maybe don't, as married couples, but it's called something different, and that's an issue. And we've seen that within our history, and we know that's an issue. So it's something we're attempting to remedy, and that's the issue we're focusing on right now. And I think that's the
right. But the law can't be arbitrary. So the justices want to know, all right, if we strike down this law because you say that the male-female aspect of marriage law is irrational and arbitrary, tell us why the number 2 is somehow rational and not arbitrary. Because then I can explain why the number 2 came about, because it was one man and one woman. Because the act that creates a new life involves one man and one woman, and every child has one mother and one father. That's where we got to the number 2. But if you say that that's arbitrary, that that's irrational, that that's animus, why would the law retain? What's magical about the number 2? And you can't just say as a legal response that, well, no one's asking about that right now. Well, people are. There's a lawsuit right now in Utah challenging the ban on bigamy. So unlike same-sex marriage, polygamy actually is criminalized in America. You can go to jail for having a bigamous relationship. And right now there's a lawsuit in federal court in Utah for a right to practice polygamy. But so there's a question, and I think that's what Sotomayor was asking about. How do you want us, what's our response there going to be? And I don't think you can just say either there's not enough critical mass right now asking for that, or that historically we've just always done it this way. Because you wouldn't accept those responses from someone against redefining marriage to include same-sex couple if they said that to you. Well, historically we've always had it between a man and a woman, and gays and lesbians are only 3% of the population, so there are not that many of them. That wouldn't work as a legal answer. So that's what I'm looking for. Can you point to what the principle is that would retain the other aspects of marriage law if you say that the male-female component is arbitrary? Yep.
I think our current system, the way we look at marriage, is that we put 2 equals. And I don't think that historically that was necessarily the case. I mean, just obviously the fact that women have been considered equal. Even sometimes in as to marriage of one male and multiple females. And I think that that is intrinsically sexist. I mean, to its core, it's a sexist.
Right, but what if they're consenting adults? I mean, so are you passing judgment on the women who
No,
voluntarily
no,
enter into those relationships?
No, of course not, but I do think that when...
Well, then why should the law prevent it? Right? So if they're consenting adults, again, like, you can personally not want to enter into a polygamous relationship, and you have that right. But who are you to tell people that they can't enter into a polygamous relationship?
I'm saying in terms of the current law, we view that like...
But why should we keep the current law? That's the question. And if we're going to change the current law is between a man and a woman, if we're going to change that law, why should we not go further and change it to be whatever size and shape of consenting adults who want a marriage license? Whether it be between 2 or 10, whether it be sexual or platonic, whether it be sexually open or sexually exclusive, whether it be permanent or temporary. Why should we have a marriage law that has any particular size and shape if you're going to say that the male-female thing is arbitrary? That's the question. I don't think you can just point to history as an answer, because I can point to history for the male-female thing as well.
Well, it's because of the concept that you talked about earlier of like being distracted within a marriage. Like you talked about like if you allow people to have sex outside of marriage, the man or woman or whatever is distracted outside of the current situation. And in a home or marriage, whatever, where there's more than one partner, it's distracted. You can't focus on one thing. You're not fully invested in one part unless you're like if you have, say it's a man and 2 women and he has children to each parent, he's going to be distracted on which one's to focus on, which one is like his family, which one is like the prime family, and all of this.
Right, and that argument points back to my overarching argument that marriage is between a man and a woman for the purpose of creating a family type that's best suited for raising children. So if you're going to hold that argument to get rid of polygamy, I don't see how you can then say it doesn't work.
No,
for the same sex law. That's the same argument, right?
No, I'm specifically talking about monogamy in a relationship. Because like in a gay relationship, or...
Right, so the same-sex couple, what's the problem for the same-sex couple? The same-sex couple can't produce children.
Well, I'm talking about monogamy from the parents' perspective. They're invested in one instance, one situation. This is their world. This is what matters.
Right, so I thought that was the relationship distracted from multiple people. Right, so what would be distracting for the throuple that New York Magazine introduced me to? It's 3 gay guys that live together in Brooklyn. And right now, you're going to have, who's coming to speak next week? Chris Perry. So the Perry of Perry v. Windsor. Perry v. Windsor. How many work in Perry? Get my cases straight. Right? So the person in the same-sex couple that is sued over Proposition 8 is coming to speak next week. What if the 3 guys in this throuple came to speak the following week? And they said, we have a constitutional right to marriage equality too. Your response is going to be, well, your attention is going to be divided. And you're denying that our constitutional right
against either. So like,
because my argument applies to a relationship that has appropriate capacity. That was my point, that whatever the merits or demerits of throuples and quartets and sexually open relationships among people of the same sex, when that behavior is engaged in with people of opposite sexes, it creates fragmented families and fatherless children. And that's why the government is in the marriage business, and it recognizes marriage and marital norms as a monogamous, exclusive, and permanent relationship for a man and a woman. But I don't see how you can then say that those norms would apply to the same-sex throuple. And so that crystallizes, I think, the disagreement that we had. Where are we on time? Okay, we'll do one last question, or these 2 questions. It's right in front of me. Then you first, and then you into that.
I'm going to argue in favor of throuples of multiple polygamous. Because, and I know exactly what this. We see that, yes, it takes a man and a woman to make a child, but it takes so much more than that to make a child. There's traditions in alloparenting where there's one father and multiple mothers, and all the mothers raise the children. The children are successful in becoming adults because they have adults who are caring and loving them. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's their parents or not. It's the fact that they have the love given to them and then all the resources provided. So why are you arguing against polygamous relationships when
explained it, I'll explain it again. The state has an interest in limiting the number of sexual partners that I have. Because the more sexual partners that I have, the greater the likelihood that I produce fragmented families. That if I'm sleeping with my wife and with my secretary, there's a greater likelihood that I'm creating children with two women. If I'm what was that? What was that?
Just said always the secretary.
Okay. So, I mean, the point is that the marital norms of a monogamous, exclusive, permanent relationship serves the state's interest in minimizing the social costs of family fragmentation. And that's why we're interested in those norms for this type of relationship. And we can leave other consenting adults free to live and love how they want to, while holding up this as an ideal because it serves a public purpose of producing the next generation of citizens to be law-abiding productive members. Yes?
We already have a judicial track record on same-sex couples arguing for equal rights to adopt children. Right? And so these children are the goods produced from a different union, not their own. Do we have a judicial track record for same-sex couples arguing that they also have a right to two women having a right to men's sperm, or two men having a right to women's eggs and women's wombs?
We don't yet have that judicially, but there are concerns, especially with the nationalized healthcare program like Obamacare, so we can get back to the Obamacare discussion, that if you think that there's a right to reproductive access, that, you know, so look at the current healthcare mandate from HHS that says that everyone has to provide cost-free contraception. It could also be the case that they would say everyone has to provide cost-free IVF, because everyone has a right to reproductive freedom, and that includes the right not to have a child, but also the right to have a child. And if the law then said you had to treat all married couples equally, regardless of same-sex or opposite sex, it would then be incentivizing not just adoption by same-sex couples, but the creation of a child who from the very moment of conception would be denied either a mother or a father. So that's also a concern of people who share my view on this debate, is that with government subsidized or government coerced health care, that some of the services that will be required will include artificial reproductive technologies, and that they will have to be provided to all employees on an equal footing, regardless of family type, and that this would further incentivize the creation of fatherless or motherless children. Okay, so with that, I think we'll finish.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I really appreciate the back and forth and the good discussion that we had with Mr. Anderson. Even if you disagree with him, I'm sure you can respect the fact that he knows what he's talking about, and with his positions. And I think it's very important for our country to have this type of national discussion on such an important issue. So thank you very much for coming. Have a good night.